Hey everybody, so it's Dr. Bam. This is my first mini lecture of this semester. And so this is one way that I would like to start doing some of the questions. You saw some of my older material in the previous assignment, and this is going to be some of my newer stuff that's actually designed specifically to this class and not using a discussion from a previous, so it should match. So today we're looking straight out of the book that we have. And we're looking at Sigmund Freud's psychosexual theory. And so when we talk about Sigmund Freud, like it says here, he's been very influential and he's also very controversial, especially back in the day. So he had some new ideas and some things people hadn't heard before. A lot of times when we hear about Freud, we hear a lot about the sexual part, and that can kind of shut some people down in regards to his theory. But in the end, Freud really is a foundational member of developmental theory and how we look at things and how we view children and people and their development, especially cognitive and other types of development as well. So I just wanted to make sure that we brought up Freud. I'm going to try to keep these little sections really short, 5 to 10 minutes tops. Sorry, you might hear little dings because it's going live, but so we need to recognize that he's been a major part. So for this question that you're going to have, and you're welcome to go back to your book, you can see this is on page 3536. We're really going to get into the id, the ego, and the superego. And so I like to think about the id, the ego, and the superego in 3 parts. We're going to want to know these terms because we're going to talk again about them in the future in relation to when they start to really evolve and come out. Okay, so in the id, we really see that as that's what the babies are born with. They're born with their biological urges, right? They're looking for, they're run by pleasure and pain. If they're not comfortable, they're going to cry. If they're hurt, they're going to cry. If they're upset, they're hungry, they're wet, they're going to cry, right? If they're, they get that smile after they have drank some milk and they're in that like happy, what we always call milk coma, that's that pleasure piece, right? So when we first get our little ones, they're really got that id, right? And then we're going to slowly see that ego start to develop as they move on. So then we have the id, and then we have the ego portion, right? So your ego is run by your logic, your reality. It's your ability to wait as mom is preparing a meal, right? And so ego is starting to develop kind of within the first year of the baby's life, and we're going to talk about that at a later part because we're not really getting into their different age. But that ego is the part of us that's able to use that logic, able to calmly reason and think and process and all of that, okay? And then when we hear the superego portion, right? So that's the third piece of his theory. And that's the society. That's the morality. That's the values. Those are the, I always say, when I think superego in my head, I think of Jiminy Cricket. Some of you might not know them, but Jiminy Cricket sitting on the shoulder, right? Or you see the devil and the angel, right? Those are your superego. So your id, in some cases, people see it as bad, but it's not always bad, right? But they see it as looking for that pleasure, and that your superego saying, hey, you need to delay it, or it's not appropriate, or it's against societal rules, right? And so that superego is really that guided by the sense of that society, the guilt, the moral, the values. So that's the first part of the question that we have. And the second part is really looking at his different stages. And I'm sorry if you hear a bunch of stuff, my kids might be busting in a second. So we're going to get into Erik Erikson next in a video, but Freud himself had these 5 stages. So the first stage is the oral stage, and we see that occur at birth to about 2, like it says here. And really think about this in regards to other theorists. Hey, sorry for the brief pause. I had the kiddos come in. Okay, so we've got 5 stages, the oral stage being that birth to 2. We'll see this kind of mirror what Piaget says with sensory motor. But in the oral stage, it's really about that sticking everything in our mouth, right? You have the obviously the breastfeeding, the milk, passies really are stimulating. And so we need to make sure this is being balanced. We'll talk here, it says too much will lead to too much, or too little could lead to a fixation. And so you probably sometimes heard oral fixation or oral obsession. And some, Freud, in his theory, would link this back to the oral stage, that they either didn't get enough oral stimulation or they got too much oral stimulation. So the next is the anal stage. And in the anal stage, think about it. This is our 2s, 4s. This is where potty training is occurring. And they're really focused on the controlling of those biological functions, right? We see the ego is coming in and stronger, is developing, is coming out. They're able to make logic. They're able to go hide behind the, they know they're going to poop and then go hide behind the chair. And so this is that anal stage, okay? So with anal fixation, just like with oral fixation, we can see that this can lead to future problems, or Freud would say this would lead to future problems. Someone with the anal fixation may be compulsively clean, compulsively organized, or they may be super sloppy and have a lack of self-control because they haven't learned to balance those biological functions. The next is the phallic stage, and this moves into our early childhood, right? And this is also when the superego comes in. So kind of cool when you look at development, kids have gotten those 3, id, ego, superego, prior to pre-K. And so we think, these are, now obviously they're going to grow and be fleshed out as they get older, but really they're there and they're functioning. So we know that pre-Kers have that sense of morality, and they're starting to pick up on the social cues. And we see this, so phallic stage is representing sexuality, right? So they are getting that sense of masculinity, that sense of femininity, the cultural dictates. How does a male behave? How does a female behave? We see some of those gender pieces coming in, and all of that. So they begin to understand the concepts of sex. We'll see the little girls that are 4 pretending to get married and things like that, and having babies, and because they're picking up on those pieces. The next stage is the latency, and this is middle childhood, when a child, they're kind of leveling out, they're quieting down, their peers become very critical, become a heavy focus, and we'll talk later when we look at middle childhood that peers and adolescence, that peers can be a bigger focus than family and educators. And they're going to really fine tune those ego and superegos, right? They're really going to be getting them developed. They're clearly able to think logically, especially with concrete items. They are able to start thinking in the abstract towards the end of this phase. They're able to create cooperation, negotiation, friendships. They understand societal norms, all of that. And the last is the genital stage. And this is when puberty happens, and you're in that stage through adulthood. And this is when you become preoccupied, or you're thinking about sex and reproduction and all of those pieces. Now remember, this is in Freud's theory, right? And all of that. So theory, we talked about a couple items back. Theory is not fact. Theory is tested. Theory is put forth. Theory is evaluated and expanded and all of that. But we have to be very careful when we take it for fact. So when Freud would look through a Freudian lens, that is how he would look through things. So obviously he's been heavily criticized. He really was a groundbreaker, but whenever you're a groundbreaker, you kind of get torn apart as people question and analyze and think through these things. And so there are many people since have come back and said this is why we don't think Freud is right or that. But he started the movement. He started us looking at things, right? One of the major weaknesses is that it is sexist, which we can find in a lot of the theorists are going to be white men, because back in the time when these theories started getting developed and fleshed out, that's who was in academia. It was white males. And so do recognize that Freud would say that is probably a bias. So he probably would recognize that as well. He was working in a different time and place. Other people have criticized the critical importance. So you can see by adolescence, you are done working through the stages and the rest is just adulthood. So people have criticized them for just overly focusing on early childhood experiences, and other people have said, hey, look how much of these theories actually play into how we look at early childhood. Look how critical early childhood is. Look how much occurs and develops in those first 8 to 12 years. And so it's very interesting there. So there are a lot of other criticisms, and I encourage you to go out and look at the weaknesses and strengths of his theory. But the fact is we still talk about this theory today. So it's still an important piece in all of our literature, in all of our classwork and coursework for this stuff. And so it's important to know and understand. Okay, now you've heard the lecture. Go ahead and head over to the question.